Hello, and thank you for logging on to the Foundation for Physician Advancement podcast channel in partnership with Convey Med. FPA is a nonprofit built for and run by Marnie Reed and a group of dedicated physician educators. Our mission is to help physicians build a successful practice in today's healthcare setting through the development of your leadership skills and business acumen. I'm Marnie Reed, Executive Director, and we hope you enjoy today's discussion. This episode was recorded live at one of our Building a Successful Practice courses, so please pardon any background noise and conference references. This didactic features Dr. Cynthia Emory giving a high-level review of understanding the basic terms and financial statements that every early career surgeon should learn.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you guys have gotten some coffee and are refreshed. So you already know Rich, you already know Neil, and welcoming our new panelist, David Blain, who's with us from Blue Sky Wealth. So I'm going to be giving you guys a primer on operations, and some of these terms have come up already in conversation, but I wanted to go through some of the basic financials. A lot of this stuff may be totally foreign to you. That is okay. That is why you're here, is to learn the language of business. You don't need an MBA for this talk, I promise. So after lunch, we've already talked, Rich is going to be going through the basics of billing and coding. So we won't be spending a whole lot of time on that. It's a good time to do that. Everyone's interested in how you're going to get paid. So you want to understand all of these things. You're not going to fall asleep. My focus today is how to break down the finances of a practice. And so this would be a real snoozer if this was after lunch, for sure. So thank you, Marnie, for not scheduling this after lunch. No, actually, this is really important and often an area that's really overlooked. You get your contract, you want to know how much money you're going to make, all these other sorts of things. Sometimes you might see financial statements, but you really don't know what you're looking at. So I'm going to be giving you an accounting primer. Basically, I'm going to take about 10% of what I learned in business school, break it down to a very simple model so that you can understand some of the terms and what we're going to be going through. Okay? This is what a balance sheet looks like. So you may have seen something like this before, looked at that last line, and then maybe moved on because you had no idea what any of that stuff meant on the slide. So a balance sheet basically is a statement of assets, liabilities, and equity, or capital for a business. So what you have, what you owe, and what's potential. That's basically what this is telling you. And you may have seen an income statement. Again, looking at the bottom line and then moving on to the next thing because you're not really sure what it's trying to tell you. So some of you may be wondering what the difference is, and some of you may actually be totally zoned out and on your phones. Okay, so a balance sheet is basically a statement looking at your cash, your assets, and your liabilities, and these I have descriptions. I'm not going to read all that to you, right? But you want to understand the stuff that you have, your cash, your AR. You may have heard of a term called days in AR, accounts receivable. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. You want to understand what your inventory is, right? How much DME you've got in your practice. You want to understand your property, plant and equipment. That's typically how that's listed, right? Your MRI, the x-rays, the building, all those sorts of things. Then you also want to know how much the practice owes. That's debt. Right? Usually you have debt in order to build a building or to get an MRI machine. If you have all that cash to pay for it out of the gate, that's probably a financial problem that we'll talk about. That's another risk. You also want to understand your accounts payable, how much you owe, your interest payable, your taxes payable, all that sort of stuff. Those are liabilities. And then equity is really when you're talking about if you're going to be issuing stock, and depends on how your practice is structured. How you pay dividends, what your wages are, the depreciation, tax expense, all of that's going to decrease your equity. Good so far? Trying to keep this pretty basic. Okay. So an income statement, sometimes that's also referred to as a P&L, or profit and loss. Some of you may have been hearing P&L before and didn't really know what it stood for, so profit and loss. It's really looking at your practice's finances. So balance sheet is going to show the financial position of a business at a point in time. Your income statement is really going to be looking at it over a period of time. Typically, you will see that quarterly or annually. All right, so what's profit? Very simple. Revenue minus your expenses. We all balance our checkbook, right? You can look at the end of the year and you can see what your profit is in your bank account. Margin is basically the same thing, but if you work in a not-for-profit system, you have to call it margin. You can't call it profit, otherwise you can't say you're a not-for-profit health system, okay? It's the same thing. Direct contribution to margin is often a term that's used when you're trying to distinguish service line functions or profitability versus maybe individual. And so direct contribution to margin is revenue minus your variable expense. Okay, well, what's variable expense? So your variable expenses are things that change in proportion to productivity. Your supplies, your labor, your utilities, all those sorts of things go up as you do more stuff. Your fixed costs don't change with changes in productivity. So that's how much you're paying for your building that you're practicing in. That's how much you're paying for your insurance, for your malpractice, all those sorts of things. Those are fixed costs. Good so far? Okay, so a couple of other things I wanted to hit on this. So you need to see where that falls. If it looks like a company is making a ton of money, it could be because they're showing you direct contribution to margin and that they've got salary categorized as a fixed expense. So it's not going to hit there. Does that make sense? So you really just want to understand the finances, and we'll be talking a lot about that with this panel. So you need to see the operating income. That's really what you want to understand. You want to understand the operating income. On the flip side, if you're in a hospital employed model with other service lines, you may need to see the direct contribution to margin to better represent the value of what your service brings, if you've got a kind of a shared model. If I've got space in a new building that's still being depreciated, that's going to lower my service line's operating margin because that depreciation expense is still going to hit the line. So this is a made-up example of what a financial statement could look like. So operating income, again, is your revenue minus your expenses. So if you want to know operating margin, you take that and divide it by the total revenue, and that gives you a percent. So in this example that I just made up, in fiscal year 21, you can see that the practice made money, but in fiscal year 22, they lost money. So then what you want to understand is what's the primary driver when you're looking at this very simple financial statement? What's the primary driver why they lost money? Yeah, labor expense. Right? You guys have all heard how much contract labor, the nurse premium wages, the staff wages, all that stuff. Health systems, practices, everybody's paying through the nose for contract labor right now. So this is not an unrealistic example of what practices look like from FY21 and FY22. 70% of hospital systems were projected to have an operating loss in fiscal year 22. 70%. And that's largely due to labor and supply cost. So you want to understand if you're going to be looking at the books, and we'll be talking about that when you go to interview for positions, you want to understand the finances of your company, of your organization, of your practice, and what that trend has looked like over the past few years. Overhead's an important concept that you need to ask about because it's difficult to see it clearly in a financial statement. People can attribute overhead differently. So this is basically cost as a percentage of revenue. So let's say that you're collections based and you collect $2 million for the stuff that you do. OR cases, office visits, all the clinical work. Well, you don't get $2 million. There's this thing called overhead, which is kind of annoying, but you need it. And so that you can do all of this stuff that you get paid to do. So most practices have overhead of probably around 50%. That's probably a reasonable ballpark figure. Labor historically was about 50% of overhead. Now that overhead is probably closer to 60 or 65% in most places. And so practices are really seeing a tremendous increase in their overhead, and they're not seeing a compensatory increase in revenue. So that's why we're having all these drivers about how can you make more money for your health system, for your practice. Another consideration when you're looking at practices, especially for women who plan to have children, or if you're going to have an anticipated FMLA or unanticipated FMLA, are you responsible for paying your overhead if you're going to be out on medical leave for a period of time? Those are questions that you need to ask, and then I can give some suggestions on ways to ask that question instead of going into an interview and saying, tell me about your maternity leave policy, because that can be very intimidating for a woman who's interviewing for a position, especially if there's no other women in the group. What if you're going to have surgery? If you're going to be out for a couple months, right, we've got early recovery after surgery, sure, but if you're going to have a spine fusion, right, you're going to be out of work for a little while. Are you expected to pay your overhead while you're out of work? So these are the main accounting ratios that are applicable to healthcare, and so we're going to be spending some time, just a few minutes, talking about what these things really mean. So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time. Financial leverage is basically looking at how much you owe versus how much you make. This is a concept that we learn very early in college when we all get our first credit card, right? Remember that? You have this idea that you can get all this stuff, that you basically just have like this line of credit. You have all this money to buy things. And then very soon you realize that you're paying for months on something and you end up spending $300 on a $100 pair of shoes. So same idea with medical practices. Sure, you can borrow a lot of money to build a practice, and you may need to do that during your startup. But it's important to understand what those ratios look like if you're joining a practice to see what you're getting into. If you're going into a brand new building or a shiny new ASC with pretty robots and all the state-of-the-art technology and all those things that they use to lure you in, you need to understand that the practice is on the hook. What you have to understand what the practice is on the hook for. And then what your share is going to be in 2 years when you have the opportunity to buy in and acquire a lot of that debt and to share. So there are variations of these leverage ratios. So there's debt to equity ratio, debt to cap. There's different things, but basically they all indicate how highly leveraged a practice or a hospital is relative to its debt. A ratio of 1 or less is optimal. More than 1 is going to indicate a financially risky situation. So your liquidity or your solvency is basically your ability to pay your bills on time. Funds that are used to run the business, right? You got to have payroll. You got to make payroll. You guys have seen all those things in the news during COVID and shortly after that about how there were practices that couldn't make payroll. Hospitals were closing as they couldn't make payroll. And that's because they had liquidity issues. Lease payments, right? Medical practice loans. Does your practice have more of these because of COVID? A lot of practices took out medical practice loans to help cover payroll when they weren't bringing in any money when cases weren't able to be done. So you want to understand how much of that debt is still in existence. Is there equipment or construction costs? Other startup, lease and utilities, buying an existing practice, all that stuff is going to factor into this here. This was really big during COVID when larger systems had more assets and they could weather the storm, so to speak. Here, a ratio of less than 1 is bad. Usually you're looking for something around 1.5 to 2 for your ratio. If you have a ratio greater than 2, if you have a lot of assets and you're not necessarily investing them quite as well, a ratio more than 2 kind of suggests that maybe those assets are being hoarded, and then that can diminish your ability to get future returns. So your current ratio, current assets basically are cash equivalents, accounts receivables, bad debt allowance, inventory. Those are your current assets. Your current liabilities are bills that you have to pay within a year. Typically, those are going to be your accounts payable, your interest payable, wages payable, income taxes payable, that kind of stuff. Efficiency. So your days in AR, this is the days in accounts receivable. This is how fast is your practice, how efficient is your practice being able to acquire the money that is owed to them. Typically, days in AR or accounts receivable should be around 30 to 70 days in that window. If you've got greater than 60 days in AR, this is like getting bills out the door, essentially. That can indicate some financial trouble. This really matters, as Mike alluded to before, if you're collections based, because the longer that days in AR, the longer it's going to take for you to get your paycheck. If you have a high receivables turnover, so that's usually like an efficient collection of your accounts receivable, multiple turns during the year. That's usually going to indicate, if you can have a better payer mix, less bad debt, higher cash business, all of those things are favorable. A low ratio can mean that you have an inadequate collections process. You're not working your denials, you're not collecting on your accounts receivable. People who can't pay, maybe you have a large self or unfunded patient population. So you want to understand what the ratios are by payer. So CMS, work comp, commercial, all those things are going to be a little bit different, understanding what those ratios are. Profitability, this is what everybody's ultimately interested in for your surgery center, for your practice, for your health system. That's what's left over after paying for everything else. So a good operating margin for a private practice is probably going to be somewhere around 10 or 12%. There's a huge amount of variability. That's just rough ballpark. A good operating margin for a not-for-profit health system is around 5%. That's typically, I think, what a lot of people aspire to. Many hospital systems in the past year or so, their operating margins have been like 1 or 2% or negative. And so that's certainly something that's not sustainable. And so then you start having questions about, well, where can I get some of that money? And how can we be more profitable? So that's basically like the accounting primer. I didn't want to get too much in the weeds because I really want to have some time to have a conversation with our wonderful panel faculty.
Thank you again for listening in. We hope you enjoyed the discussion with our FPA faculty. If you'd like to learn more about our mission or upcoming events, please visit our website at www.buildingasuccessfulpractice.org.